Good afternoon, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn with the League. My name is Kathy Morgan, and with me here is Susan King Roth. We are co-presidents of the Ventura County League. A few housekeeping items before we start. Please remain muted throughout the session. There will be a Q&A session after we hear from our speakers today. So if you have any questions for them, please put the questions into the chat directed to Kathy Morgan. The chat button can be found at the bottom of the screen. I would like to advise you that this session is being recorded, and the link to the recording of the sessions will be available on our League website within 48 hours. The link to our website is in the chat. Lastly, discrimination or harassment of any kind will not be accepted within the League, including, but not limited to, race, socioeconomic status, age, ability status, religion, sexual orientation, national orientation, gender identity, or marital status. The goal of today's Lunch and Learn with the League is to gain a deeper understanding of the Electoral College. With the national election quickly approaching, this is a timely topic, and we are very excited to have three impressive speakers from the U.S. League with us today. On behalf of myself, Co-President Susan King Roth, and the entire League of Women Voters of Ventura County, thank you very much for being here to speak with us today. To provide an uninterrupted presentation, I am going to introduce all of the speakers at once in the order in which they will be presenting. Tracy Atkinson is a current National League and LWVEF board member. She has been a leader, advocate, and mentor for over 18 years. By trade, she is an award-winning project manager. Tracy made history by being elected the first African-American president of the League of Women Voters of Georgia. Next, I would like to introduce Joan Huneau. Joan previously served as a National League board member. Additionally, she was Advocacy VP of the Michigan LWV and Secretary of the LWV of Leelanau County. She worked 34 years in Michigan's legislature, served 10 years on her city council, and was the city's first woman mayor. Joan holds BA and MPA degrees. Our last speaker will be Selena Stewart. Selena is the Chief Executive Officer of the League of Women Voters of the United States. In this role, she is charged with executing the mission to empower voters and defend democracy, and with managing the organization's operations and resources. Selena first joined the League in 2018 as Director of Advocacy and Litigation. In this role, she developed and implemented League political strategies and policy positions around voting rights, election reform, redistricting, and campaign finance issues, directed prospective litigation opportunities involving the national, state, and local leagues in federal courts, worked closely with League grassroots staff in implementing the national agenda, and served as a lead lobbyist and liaison with Congress and administration for the League. She was promoted to Senior Director in April of 2019 and to Chief Counsel in July of 2020. In these roles, she worked to incorporate a broader strategic vision. Selena earned her JD from Western Michigan University Law School and her BA in Sociology from Spelman's College. She has served on multiple boards and was an American Bar Foundation Law Practice Fellow. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to all three of you, and we are so grateful that you are here with us today. At this time, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you for that excellent introduction of all three of us. And we are so excited to be here with the League of Women Voters of California today. I give honor, and we want to recognize your state president and past national president, Chris Carson. Thank you so much, Kathy and the Lunch and Learn team, for inviting us, and Chris Carson for elevating it and making it a state event. You are so right. This is such a timely topic. So we're glad to be here. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our presentation on abolishing the Electoral College. This is a critical issue for our country, and this presentation will give you the reasons why LWV supports a direct popular vote to elect the president and vice president. We will also share some history on the Electoral College, and some very interesting myth busters. We invite you to write down your questions or drop them in the chat as Kathy gave you instructions to do. We will be monitoring and your questions will be elevated. And there may be a moment where one of the presenters will pause for questions. Next slide. So that's our agenda for today. We're going to share some basics. What is the Electoral College and what is the League's position on this method of electing our president? We'll show the problems caused by the Electoral College, problems that a direct popular vote would easily solve. Then we will review the top arguments given in favor of the Electoral College system and why each of those reasons are actually based on common myths. That's why we talked about myth busters. Oh, this is like tongue tying. Finally, we'll explain what needs to be done to abolish the Electoral College, which is an amendment to the US Constitution, and what you can do now to help that happen. Of course, we are not going to get everyone together today and not give a call to action. And hopefully we'll do all of this with plenty of time left to answer your questions. Next slide. So first of all, the Electoral College isn't a school or a building or a place. It's a group of 538 people who elect the president and vice president of the United States every 4 years. According to the US Constitution, each state legislature gets to decide how their electors will be chosen. In the beginning of our country, state legislatures just picked the electors themselves. Imagine that. Over time, states started choosing electors by popular vote within their state. Each political party has their own slate of electors when we vote. You are not voting. When we vote, you are not voting directly for a presidential candidate. You are voting for a group of state electors from the candidate's political party who have pledged to give their electoral votes to that candidate. Each state gets a specific number of electors based on their congressional delegation. One elector for each US senator and each US representative. For example, Texas has 38, and this may have changed. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, had 38 electoral votes in 2020, while Rhode Island had 4. The District of Columbia, although not a state, gets 3 electors. Importantly, the winner of the Electoral College is not whoever gets the most electoral votes. The winner must have a majority of the votes, over 50%, to win. So currently that's 270 electoral votes to win. If no candidate gets 270 votes, the US House of Representatives chooses the president, with each state having just one vote, and the Senate chooses the vice president. Next slide. Since 1970, the League's position has been that direct popular vote method for electing president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. The rest of this presentation will explain the many problems with the Electoral College that the League identified through study. You may have heard about some of these problems, but there are also some that you may not have heard about. From the board's perspective, we believe now is the time. Dr. Turner felt very passionate about this, and under her leadership, the moonshot goal was established. We realize this is a heavy lift. It's a constitutional amendment. We realize it's a serious commitment, but we also know that the League can be the leading organization to get this done. That's what we do, right? We get things done. This and other much needed changes is why the League embarked on the transformation journey. This amazing 104-year-old organization has accomplished great things, and we are striving to become a more powerful and more influential organization. We are not doing change just for the sake of doing change. We are transforming so we can accomplish more big things, just like abolishing the Electoral College. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic to Joan to give us some history.
Thank you, Tracy. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's wrong with Electoral College after that very uplifting introduction that Tracy just gave us, a challenge to action. Next slide, please. Electoral College was created in 1787 for slaveholders in the South. Specifically, there are 5 southern states at that time: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Maryland, just those 5. And there were 8 northern states. A compromise to give southern states more power in presidential elections based on counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a free person was established after debate in the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. As you can see, early on in the convention started to meet. The delegates of the convention began meeting in June, and they met until September that year. And early on, as you can see by the James Madison quote there in July, they'd already identified the main real difference between the interests that had gathered there in Philadelphia to debate or to put together the Constitution for our country. That real difference of interests lies not, Madison said, between the large and small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. You know, when the delegates gathered, they were able to draft the first article of the Constitution, the one about the U.S. Congress, with some ease. It's quite detailed. And they were able to identify and draft the third article, which is about the judiciary. They had the most trouble. They had the most trouble with the executive branch. And the reason for that was that they couldn't decide amongst themselves, despite the fact that they debated it for 21 days. They offered a range of proposals. They had 30 separate votes to try to draft Article 2, and they couldn't get it right. At the very end of August, they appointed a committee on unfinished parts. 11 delegates stuck around in Philadelphia while the rest of them went home after a heated summer. And they are the people that put together the Electoral College and the 3/5, so-called 3/5 compromise, which is so deeply racist in its origins, counting 60% of the enslaved people in those 5 states as full citizens for the purpose of selecting how many people would go to the U.S. Congress and how many people, therefore, would constitute the Electoral College. Next slide, please. The Electoral College ushered in, thanks. The Electoral College also ushered in the Jim Crow era. Between 1877 and 1964, many citizens of our fellow citizens suffered under Jim Crow rules and regulations and laws in the South. That is because after slavery was abolished, the 1876 election traded the civil rights of Black Americans to allow Rutherford B. Hayes, who lost the popular vote, to become president. For a brief period after the end of the Civil War, from roughly 1865 until 1877, rights started to be established in people of African descent who had been previously enslaved were elected to many posts in southern states, and rights were we began to establish rights for citizenship by passing amendments to our Constitution. Those were all taken away when this backroom deal was made in 1877 for the election of the president. And in that election, Rutherford B. Hayes had significantly fewer popular votes, and he had significantly fewer electoral votes, 20 fewer. And that's because the southern states, 3 of the southern states, withheld their electoral votes for his election. They got together in a back room and decided that the 3 southern states would give their 20 electoral votes to him. And in return, he had to promise to withdraw all of the federal presence that was enforcing the new laws to ensure that we had a fair Reconstruction era, to withdraw those forces from the southern states. And consequently, he gained those 20 electoral votes, gained the presidency, despite the fact that he lost both the popular vote and the electoral vote. The federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and essentially for that purpose and for that reason, Reconstruction ended. Jim Crow began. Next slide, please. The Electoral College continues to, back one. Thanks. Back to the one that says Electoral College continues to suppress the voices of Black Americans. There we go. We continue to have this difficulty as a result of these historical foundations. The problem with the Electoral College is that the states with higher Black populations tend to have less power in the Electoral College, while states with higher white populations tend to have more. That continues until today. And the solution to that problem really is a direct popular vote. Next slide, please. The Electoral College turns losers into winners. This is still problematic. It allows a candidate with fewer votes from the people, so a lower popular vote percentage, to win the presidency. As you can see by those bar charts at the bottom of this slide, in every instance where there's a gold bar, those are the people who won the presidency that year. They were elected with significantly smaller popular vote, and because they won the Electoral College, the minimum +1 or the half +1 in the Electoral College. So we really, in order to overcome this difficult problem that continues right through 2016, the only way to do that is to think of ourselves when we go to vote for president, not as people who are in various states, not as Tracy in Georgia or Joan in Michigan or Selena in Maryland, but we're Americans when we go vote for the president of the United States. All of us together, and a direct popular vote is the way to elect our president and vice president. Now I can turn it over to Selena.
Well, hello, LWV California, and thank you to Ventura County for hosting us. We appreciate the opportunity to join you all today. So yeah, I think, it's interesting to me that not a lot of people know the origin story of the Electoral College or the role that race played in establishing the Electoral College. And so when we think about more than 100 years later, it's still being in place, and whether or not it serves the country, voters, or even the purpose that it was initially intended, whether or not it makes sense to keep it. And so thank you to Joan and Tracy for the background piece of this. And so I just want to dig a little deeper into some of the challenges around here. And so on the screen, you'll see that the Electoral College makes some votes count more. And we know this, right? We know that in Wyoming, you'll see this on the screen, versus Florida, these numbers represent the amount of people that each person represents, right? And depending on how big or small the state is, that means that a smaller number of people have more power and it takes more people to achieve certain things. And so if you look at this chart, Wyoming, the population is 576,000. They have 3 electoral votes. And for each electoral vote, that represents 192,000 people. It may not seem like a lot, but a good number of folks. Versus a Florida, where you have 21 million and a half, representing 29 electoral votes, and 73,000 people represent that each one of those, right? And so we think about California. California has 54 electoral votes, which is more than both of these states, right? And so it means that it takes more people, or that one person represents more people, and that vote counts more. And so it goes a little further, or it's harder, because in these larger states, it just requires so many more people to actually effectuate a vote. And so I think that's important to recognize that this is a problem with the Electoral College as it exists now. And the only way to really remove that barrier and to make sure one person, one vote actually exists is to eliminate it. So the next slide talks a little bit about the swing states. So the problem here is that the Electoral College focuses on candidates' time, money, and policy in a handful of swing states. And I want to talk through this a little bit more, because what we had in 2016 is there were 14 swing states, which seems like a lot. Actually, it was 16, I'm sorry. So 16 swing states in 2016, which was a lot. And then in 2020, it went down to 13. In 2024, it's coming down to 7 states that are really going to be the determining factor for who is elected to president. So if we look at just the progression of voting in this country, we notice that it's getting smaller. The number of states that matter in determining the election is getting smaller, which means that more states are out in terms of having an impact, having as much of an impact on the outcome. And so I think that it's important for us to realize, in terms of our work, we want to make sure that voters feel empowered. That's our mission, right? To empower voters, defend democracy. And so I think it makes our work particularly difficult, because as the field narrows, it makes it that much harder to reach people and engage people who may not feel like it matters to vote. And so this next slide is about just that, how folks are sometimes discouraged from participation. And we have here that the Electoral College decreases voter turnout in so-called safe states, whereas the solution is, if we increase voter turnout and participation by making sure that every vote counts and counts equally, that changes things. That changes how people have to campaign. It changes who is motivated to show up. It changes how people engage in the civic process, or in the electoral process, and just civically engage as a whole. And so one of the things I want to mention, that the Electoral College not only makes some voters matter more than others, it gives people a reason not to vote. It actually decreases voter turnout in so-called these safe states. And if we look at the data from 2016 and 2020, which is also on there, you can see this more clearly. In the graph, you can see that the percentage of eligible voters who cast a vote for president was significantly lower in safe states compared to swing states. And these differences may seem small, but only 6 or 7 percentage points makes a difference. And that translates into 15 million people who registered to vote in non-swing states and who chose not to vote, versus the 22 million in the states who chose not to vote in 2020. And so we know, looking at our own state, California in particular, some of these local races are not that far apart. Sometimes hundreds or thousands of voters. I mean, it's not a ton. It doesn't take millions of voters to really determine some of these smaller races. And so just pointing that out so we can see just the local impact and just the real impact that this has on the voting process and our work to engage more people. Okay, so this next slide is why it makes it easy to cheat. And we've seen that there's a lot of mis and disinformation narratives going around. And so I think that, this is particularly important for this time. And so we have here the problem where the Electoral College makes our presidential elections more vulnerable to manipulation or even outright fraud or claims of fraud, right? That's what we're dealing with mis and dis. And the direct popular vote, it kind of resolves some of this, right? Because it increases election security by making it harder to influence the outcome, not only because the states that matter grow, but the input from voters matters more too. So it's just a harder cross to bear there. So now we're going to move a little bit into some of the myths that come around the Electoral College and trying to dispel some of those myths, as Tracy mentioned. And so I would turn this back to, are you handling 1 and 2, Joan, or is Tracy?
Tracy.
Tracy, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, so is this okay? Mythbusters. Next slide. Common arguments for the Electoral College. The first myth: without the Electoral College, our presidents would be chosen by a few big states like California and New York. Well, the fact is that votes from most or all states would be needed to win the presidency by a direct popular vote. And I'm glad that this is myth number 1 because it is, in my opinion, the biggest. And it's not an oxymoron, but I can't even think of the word right now. But I'm glad that we're highlighting this because many people, you would be surprised at the number of people who actually really think this, but it couldn't be further from the truth. Next slide. Oh, 2012 popular votes for Barack Obama, 63.4 million votes needed to win the popular vote. And I think if you advance again, all right. Keep going. Yes, votes from 39 states were needed to win the popular vote. And I apologize, I don't have my talking points in front of me because I thought Selena was going to complete the presentation. Joan or Selena, do you want to do the next one?
Okay, thank you. I'll be happy to do it if you'd like me to.
Okay.
So the Electoral College myth number 2. Without the Electoral College, our presidents would be chosen by a few big cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Well, once again, there aren't enough people living in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, even though there are millions of people living there all combined. Or even in the 50 biggest cities in the United States of America to choose a president on their own. You can see the pieces of the pie there, the total pie, the total group of citizens who vote. If we just look at New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, it's 5%. And if it's the 10 biggest cities in the United States of America, it's only their populations all combined only constitute 8%. And likewise with the 50 biggest cities, 15%. Notice that rural voters in the United States of America constitute fully 14% of the total voting population, almost as much as the cities. And when people campaign in a place like Michigan, where there's one big city and a rural area, that's the way we think about our state campaigning in it. A third of it's suburban, a third of it's urban, and a third of it's rural. Move on to the next slide, please. And this is
Joan,
yeah.
I can do number 3.
Okay.
So
good.
myth number 3, abolishing the Electoral College will only benefit Democratic candidates. To bust this myth, let's look at the 2004 presidential election, the Bush-Kerry election. On the left is the Electoral College map for the 2004 election, where George W. Bush won over John Kerry with 3 million more popular votes than Kerry. The map on the right shows how close George W. Bush came to winning the popular vote, but losing the Electoral College. Can you spot the difference? It's just one state, and that's actually my home state, Ohio. If John Kerry had received only 119,000 more votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College and the election, even though Bush would still have had nearly 3 million more popular votes. The fact is that the Electoral College can hurt either of our two major political parties. This is a nonpartisan issue. Next slide. Electoral College myth number 4. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to eliminating the Electoral College is just plain pessimism. Many people feel that the Electoral College will never be abolished because it would take a constitutional amendment to do it. It's never going to happen. Is a common comment we hear all too often. What we need to defeat is defeatism. Here's a timeline showing the dates that all constitutional amendments were ratified. The Bill of Rights is shown with just one bar. You can see that our history includes flurries of constitutional activity punctuated by long periods of inactivity. There was a period of 60 years between the first two clumps, then another gap of 43 years. There were 18 years between the amendments of the 1930s and those of the 1950s and 60s. Then a gap of 21 years to the 27th Amendment in 1992. It's been 30 years since then. So what say you, LWV California? What distinguishes these periods of constitutional activity? They tended to be periods of great national political activity, where citizens were feeling that our democracy was in crisis. Sounds familiar? Where the demand for change across our society was persistent and loud. There was the period after the Civil War, the Progressive Era, at the turn of the last century, and the Civil Rights Era in the 1950s and 60s. We seem to be in the middle of another period of political activity. Demand for change is high. Only time will tell, but the level of engagement we are seeing now and the genuine concerns about the resiliency of our democracy are remarkable. Next slide.
You know what's interesting about that? Can I just chime in here? Especially about this last slide is, you know, we put this in here because it's important to talk about it and the attempts that have been made. But one of the things that is not here and why the league is engaging on this is because in all these times, there's never been a grassroots movement behind this. And so I feel like that is the particular value that the league holds in having this as our moonshot. Is we're bringing grassroots power, people power to this movement where it has been based primarily in academia, like a lot of theorists, you know, theories talking and talking heads about it. But, you know, it really comes down to brass tacks and being able to move it in states. And so that's what excites me because it's going to be dreary. Like thinking about the origin and how many times it's been done, it can be dreary, but I think the inspiring side of it, the hopeful side of it is knowing that we are bringing something so different to what has been done for the last 27 times. Sorry, Tracy. I just wanted to get that in there because we don't always talk about it.
No problem. You're going to talk about what needs to be done?
Absolutely. So first, leveraging our grassroots movement, right? I think that's going to be an important. Our ultimate goal is the constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College. Now, we know California already worked on national popular vote, so now we're past that, right? It's about moving to this next step. And so I'm so glad that we're doing education around this because the educating around the Electoral College and really making sure that we bring this from out of the clouds down to people and understanding is really important. And so first, a bill to propose an amendment needs to pass both the U.S. House and the Senate by 2/3 of a vote. You can go to the next slide. That's not easy. We know this, especially if you all are doing any lobbying work at your state capitals, you know that that is not easy, and nor should it be. This is a really important change that we need to happen. So then after that, the proposed amendment needs to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. We've seen this before, right? We had to do this with the ERA and all of that work there, and that's 38 states. Again, not easy, but doable for a group like the League. And so we can do this. I think we are best positioned to do something like what we're proposing here in abolishing the Electoral College. But also note that it doesn't require, and the league doesn't support, a constitutional convention to accomplish this. We know that con-cons open up so many pitfalls and literally is opening up interrogation of the Constitution without guardrails. So we want to make it clear that we are supportive of a constitutional amendment, but not a constitutional convention. And so this usual amendment process outlined here would do the job of abolishing the Electoral College without having to engage in more dangerous legislative advocacy and such. Next slide. Okay, so actions in the U.S. House and Senate. So we've seen from 1968 and 70, this has been a very popular initiative across the country for years, decades. So this is not new. We had 338 House of Representatives vote to abolish this, and of course that was they were unpopular. The 70 people who did not vote for it were unpopular at the time. But the bill died in the Senate when filibustered by Southern Democrats. And then 2019 till present, bills have been introduced in both the House and Senate, no vote as of yet. But there's a grassroots movement happening around the country to move the national popular vote, which we think will be evidence and can be used in really pushing the Electoral College at the federal level. So just wanted to point out that. And then the next. So what do we need and what can you do? Momentum. The League of Women Voters is, like I said, uniquely positioned to empower voters through education and advocacy at the local, state, and the national level. And so we know that once we activate, we actually have momentum. We are the movement that creates things. And so you'll see the image here. It's LWV out to the edge, hitting all the balls that create the influence that we have been doing for more than a century in the country. And so if we want to distill it down in the next slide, it really comes down to organizing, education, and advocacy. And so under the organizing bucket, I would say we're registering league coordinators on the task force. So there's already a movement around this. There's, calls that happen every month to get folks engaged. So please make sure that you tap into those. We can share those resources afterwards. Identifying state and local ally organizations. There's a lot of movement around this around the country, especially with young people. So as we're thinking about leagues and as we're transforming and wanting to think through who we want to attract, this particular campaign has been very palatable and motivating for young folks. And then activating supporters. Under the education budget, I have money going on in my brain, y'all. I'm always thinking about money. Education bucket. We want to enroll in the one-on-one training, which is happening. This is part of that presentation. These are the educational materials that are sanctioned by LWV US for leagues to be using. We need to be presenting to civic and social groups, colleges and universities, and members to make sure that our members, league members, are educated about what we're doing. Distributing informational brochures in your community. We have tons of resources. We have a trifold, we have a one-pager, we have palm cards all around Electoral College. And so there'll be more swag and things coming out so that as we're doing this work, we're very visible in communities doing it. And then advocacy. Like I mentioned, having swag, observing Abolish Electoral College Day on January 6th. It will be on a Monday in 2025. And then watching for action alerts, because when there's an opportunity to activate around this, especially at the federal level, we want to make sure that we can click a button and have more than 500,000 people join us in making our voices heard at the state level, but also in Congress. And so hopefully that is helpful to you in terms of how you plug in and how you can engage. But I think more importantly, our goal is to have 1 million conversations about the Electoral College. And so it takes each and every one of us just having that conversation with the people around us in our own circles in order to make that happen. So I will retire my voice and push it back for if there are any questions, and happy to work with Joan and Tracy to answer those.
Well, thank you very much. So this has been very informative, and we do have quite a few questions. And I don't even know where to begin, but you've also received a lot of kudos on the great presentation. One questioner asks, we have members that will object, saying that this is a partisan issue, even though it may have been nonpartisan in the past, a different time. Data about where the support is and showing that there is bipartisan support for this change seems important. Do you have any comments on that?
Here's the thing. Our positions, we're an issue-based organization, right? So we have positions that we study the heck out of, put in a book, and leverage at the national, state, and local level. Politics have changed, and they will. That's the evolution of politics. It's always going to move, and that's going to determine. So if our position is here and the country moves further to the right, that means our position seems farther away, right? And so I think that the one thing that we say to that is our positions are steadfast. We have studied this. Our positions don't change. It's like a whole process to change our positions, but politics has, but our values don't. And so I think that we have to really come at this from a values perspective. And that helps us understand and communicate why this doesn't move. We're not flippant. We are steadfast in what our issues are. But I want to open it up because I know the brilliant minds may have other things to say here.
Any other comment? If not, I'll move on to another question.
I don't want to be a brilliant mind, but I do want to say that the legitimacy of being elected president without the popular vote, without a winning popular vote, it really does threaten the legitimacy of the office. And that was very clear to me when I was reading Jesse Wegman's book, Let the People Pick the President. He was talking about the 2000 election when Bush, you recall the 2000 election, which was George Bush and Gore. And the Bush people actually thought at one point that they were going to lose that election. So because they thought they were going to lose it because they were going to lose in the Electoral College, they had set up an organization to do away with the Electoral College. They actually got that up and going, assuming that the outcome of that election was going to be one in which they were short in the Electoral College. So there's an example of a group of Republicans who didn't see this then, and I think many of those people still are lobbying. Recently, just a year or so ago, in the Michigan legislature, a bipartisan group of people. So I think if you're watching carefully and watching closely, in addition to the legitimacy question, you can see the shift historically. And it's a bad situation for everyone, all Americans, regardless of our political affiliation.
Thank you for expounding on that answer. That was very helpful. Someone would like to know if you could please explain what a constitutional convention is and how does it different from an amendment?
I'm happy to talk about that. So constitutional amendment is just what we outlined earlier, which is it has a numerical requirement to pass, which is that 2/3 piece, right? A constitutional convention is totally different. Because I'll just say constitutional amendment applies to a single topic. It's a single topic, a single amendment, a single topic. Whereas the constitutional convention enables legislators to make the entire constitution fair game, which means that they can go in and amend the 4th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. So it's no holds barred. It is the whole document. And so one is much more focused. Constitutional amendment is focused. It's saying we want to change this one thing and we're going to get the number of states to represent that change for that one amendment. Whereas a constitutional convention opens the entire document up, which we think is pretty dangerous because opening up the entire constitutional without any guardrails means that the rights that we just had today could be completely gone tomorrow, depending on what group is deciding. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does, thank you. But can you tell me, is there a group of a particular group that's advocating for a constitutional convention on this, in response to this issue?
In response to this issue, not that I'm aware of, but there are groups who advocate for constitutional conventions and have not been successful because I think that on both sides of the aisle and independents alike understand the danger of it. So I don't know about a particular movement, to do a con related to the Electoral College. Maybe others do, but I'm not aware of a specific movement, but it's just the concept and making it clear that we're vying for an amendment and not a convention.
All right, thank you for that. Someone else would like to have please explain again how a state becomes a swing state. What makes a swing state a swing state?
Joan, Tracy, you're both in swing states.
We're both in swing states, aren't we, Tracy? I'll start, then Tracy can pick it up. What we know about being in a swing state is that you see the presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates a lot. They are here in Michigan, and I suspect if they're not in Michigan, they're in Georgia or one of the other 4 or 5 swing states every day of the week during the campaign. And what makes us swing is that in Michigan is that we're what so-called purple state. Our state could in this election and go either for the candidate Trump or the candidate Harris. And we have polling that from day to day, almost every day, new polls that show one in the lead or the other, depending on who's in the polling sample that particular day. So because we're a purple state, they are here. We swing. We can swing either way. I mean, I wish it meant more like, musically swing, but it's not. It's we can go either way. Tracy, how's it looking down in Georgia?
It's looking like a battleground state is what it's looking like. Every week it's one or the other here, literally duking it out for votes. But yes, that is what makes us swing states. We could go either way.
And
The
it's a
votes
numerical
could go.
calculation, right? You become a swing state because the margin is so close that it could go blue or red, depending on the number of voters who turn out and how close the political demographic is. So if it's a 47, 48, that usually is swing state territory. When it's within, I think it's within 3 political points is the actual definition of it, but it's a numerical calculation.
Speaking of numerical calculations, is the number of electoral votes static, or does it change with the population? I know that California recently lost an electoral vote because of our census, but does it ever go beyond a certain number of electoral votes?
I'll take that one.
Thank you.
I was just reading about that recently, actually. Until about 1930, the Electoral College got larger and larger as the population grew. But we capped it back then, and that is we capped the number of people who went to the U.S. House of Representatives. And by doing that, we capped the Electoral College as well. And there are different reasons given for why that happened, some of which are highly partisan and speak to what may have been mischief for over several decades. But the fact is that we don't do that anymore. When we started the country, it says in the Constitution that each elected representative, each congressperson at each congressional district should represent no more than 30,000 people. And today, on average, they represent 750,000 people.
Wow.
That's the effect of of capping it. If we had left it uncapped, the estimate is that our U.S. House of Representatives would have about 1,100 members in it right now. That's what our electoral college. Yeah. Gosh,
hard to imagine anybody getting anything done with that many members of Congress. Someone asked the question, is there any reason that they would have wanted to give smaller state a bit more leverage? And then in answer to something else, another question regarding something you mentioned about, I think it was about swing states. What are recent examples of cheating? So those are 2 separate questions, but I'll just put them out there and see if anyone can take a stab at those.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? Oh, sorry.
Is there a reason that initially they would have wanted to give smaller states a bit more leverage?
Yeah, so that happened in the past, right? That's how we got the Senate.
Right.
It's good. And the two Senate rule, so that whether you were a small or big state, you had equal representation in one of the chambers in the bicameral system. So I think the Senate handles the first part. And that, some people have concerns about that because now we have a filibuster, right? Which is a minority tool used to stop or deter particular legislation from moving forward on behalf of American people.
Great. The other part of the question, I think, was in response to, you had mentioned in your discussion of swing states. I believe you mentioned that it made it more vulnerable to cheating. And someone is asking, what were the recent examples of cheating? Or perhaps
Oh, we know this. We've seen these, right? So we know that when the swing states are the 7, right? We've seen increase in voter purging happening. We have seen more consolidation of polling locations in those areas. We have seen just in Georgia recently, there was a move to have hand counting of like ballot cards and things like that. You don't always see things like that I was about to say Indiana, but I was just like, that probably ain't the best example. But you don't see that in like a Montana or Wyoming or New Hampshire, for example. And so you're going to see more activity to purge individuals, and we all want clean rolls, right? We want to make that clear. Clean rolls are a good thing, and there should be a process for maintaining and making sure people are appropriately on the rolls. But it's when it's done illegally or in mass. In Georgia in 2020, we had to file a lawsuit because there were 330,000 people threatened with being purged in just before the 2020 election. That's massive, when you think about the total population in Georgia. So things like that and the things we see every day, I think are still the bad things that happen in the swing states.
And our state election board is considering, I just read or heard today, another proposed rule change, trying to still get in more changes for an election that essentially has already started.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for expounding on that. And I want to say that I really appreciate the, what you can do kind of slide that you had and the steps for action. And one of the very first questions we got was, what do you think the chances are that the Electoral College will be abolished, that we will be successful in this movement? And I know you can't give an exact number, but do you think it's a good chance? You think that it's we're just going to keep plugging along and it'll take as long as it takes, probably? Joan.
I'll just offer 2 cents. I think there is a good chance. And that's because just today I was reading, for example, that Republicans are starting to see a shift in the way this has benefited them in the last couple of decades. They think it's not going to benefit them in the next 2 decades. And I think when that happens and that experience is recent enough, that both parties have had that. But I do think that with the 2 parties polarized the way they are right now, it does makes it a challenge for certain. But the other thing I think is we've amended that Constitution 6 different times, I guess, in that affect the way we choose our president. So we have a history of being able to do this up through about 1968, 1970. And then the bottom falls out. And I got to believe that, that we're up to trying this again when people from both major parties, feel aggrieved by it. I do think that legitimacy for young people, like Selena mentioned, and at the beginning of our discussion, Kathy, before we went online, I think you were mentioning you were doing voter registration, and a young man said to you, "Why should I vote in California?" The Electoral College makes it a fool's errand for me.
Yeah, I've heard more than one student say that their voice doesn't matter because of the Electoral College. But we still encourage them that their voice does matter, that their vote is their voice.
Yeah, we can't abdicate our power.
I'm sorry, I
Would
missed.
say, Selena, I'm sorry.
I said we can't abdicate our power, and I'm just reminded of the quote that George Wallace, senior, I mentioned this at convention too, what he said about the League. The League is the only group that he knew that didn't accept yes for an answer. I want to believe that that is what is going to carry us through, that even when we abolish the electoral college, we're going to want more. And I don't think league members will stop until we get it. So
Well, thank you
I
so
can't
much.
put a time on it. I can't put a time on it, but I believe it can be done because I personally have people ask me, what is the electoral college and why is and when I explain it, the next thing is, so you mean to tell me my vote doesn't count? And I think there is an unspoken I think the people aren't happy. And all it will take is a movement. So us initiating that movement across organizations and having the what's the word? The framework around how we can then take that energy and use it towards creating this change that needs to happen. I definitely think it can happen, but I can't tell you how quickly.
Well, you don't have a ESP or anything, do you now? Thank you
No,
so much. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but we really, really appreciate all three of you, Joan, Tracy, and Selena. You gave us a lot of information. You gave us a plan. We all appreciate it. I know we all know more about the Electoral College and how we can go about affecting change. So thank you so much for being here. And for everybody in our audience, thank you for attending today. Please let your friends know that the recordings will be available on our website in about 48 hours. And so you can direct people who weren't able to attend to our website. If you have any suggestions for future Lunch and Learn with the League topics, please put them into the chat or send us an email. And thank you very much again for being here today. We really appreciate it. And this concludes our session. Thank you so much. Bye.
thank you. Bye-bye.